Hello, friends. I'm back with a video in English after quite a while. Uh, I was going to make part 3 of the series on Ilayaraja's experiments in Darbari Kanra, but in the meantime, there was another topic that intrigued me because I was part of a discussion regarding this topic, and I thought, why not make a video about it? And I would have to use so many English words to elaborate on the concepts that I want to discuss that I thought might as well make the video in English again. So here we go. So it started with the topic of, you know, why do people say, especially older audiences, older including me perhaps, people on the wrong side of 35. So why do older audiences not like Anirudh so much? And is the usual justification, the usual explanation rather given for that is that it's because they grew up on Rahman's music, and say in my case, or Ilayaraja's music for people who would be in their 40s or 50s. But is that really the answer? That's the usual explanation that people always resort to when this topic comes up. Is like, oh no, you don't like Taylor Swift so much because you're an old fart. That's basically the rub of this argument. But is it just that? And why I'm probing this point is that if you take my case, I mean, you know, of course, by now that I'm a huge Ilayaraja fan, and I'm also a huge fan of the old Hindi composers. And by that, I don't just mean R.D. Burman or Papilari. I go back all the way to Naushad Saab's works like Baiju Bavra, or even Shankar Jaikishan's really old films like Basant Bahar, which was kind of their answer, riposte, if you will, to Baiju Bavra. So now, if you look at those films, those were in the 1950s, and then you come to 1960s. Guide, it's one of my absolute favorite albums in Hindi music, or even Kashmiri Kali again from the 60s. Then 1970s, R.D. Burman, of course, had so many great albums. There's no need to, enumerate them. Madan Mohan, that's my namesake, if I should use that word. He had a wonderful album, and it was the last album that he worked on while he was still alive. It's called Mosam. And what's common between all of these, albums, these composers? So these albums, these films rather, they all came out years and years before I was born. So if you are saying that it's nostalgia that accounts for why someone listens to older music, then my question is, how can you be nostalgic for a time and a place that you did not even live in? Because I have no idea about 1970s India. I have some idea about 1990s India. And, believe me that even if at times, especially post COVID, I feel like the world was simpler then, I know that there are so many things today that, especially in India, that are better now compared to what it used to be. Um, so starting with just the public toilets. So, you know, I would not say that I am very nostalgic about the 90s in the sense of, oh, I want to go back and live in that time again. No, definitely not. And in fact, one of the main reasons I would not want to is because you didn't have the kind of internet connectivity access that you have today, which allows me to explore so much music that most of which was actually released long before I was born again. So, as you know, that I'm a huge progressive rock fan, and the heyday of progressive rock was 1970s, and progressive rock happened in England and in the United States. I've only visited the US, and I've never even visited the UK. I've definitely not lived there. So again, how can I be nostalgic about 1970s England? Let's take that even further now. What about a jazz classic like, Summertime? I didn't say What a Wonderful World because frankly I'm not that fond of that song, but I do love Summertime. What about some of the classics of Dave Brubeck or John Coltrane, Miles Davis? I've again 1950s, 1960s. What does that have to do with nostalgia? Now let's shift tacks. Let's talk about movies in a similar light. Some of my favorite films would be Godfather, of course, then this French Connection, Clockwork Orange. Then you have coming in the 90, so then again in the 1970s you have Network, again brilliant film. Let's round up the decade with Shining, also by Stanley Kubrick. So all 1970s films and all made in places that I did not live in. So how can you say that it is nostalgia that accounts for somebody liking an older work? So the answer is no. Nostalgia doesn't account for at least all of it. Maybe sometimes it's part of it, but especially if it pertains to music or films, or the best example, books. I mean, we read so many books that were written 100, 200 years ago. So if it pertains to art that was made before the time and place you were born in, it cannot be nostalgia. So then what is it? What is it that draws us to art that was made before our time? And thinking about it, I realized that there can be a different word for it. And that word is much more universal. It doesn't restrict itself to demographics, your age group, or whatever. Simple fascination. You know, if you think about it, generally the people who do go back and listen to a lot of music that was made even before the time they were born in, they would be quite committed to exploring more and more music, what you call connoisseurs or musophiles, by whatever name. So that is to say that they have a certain interest level in music that is more than that of the casual listener. And that being the case, they have now allowed their mind to be fascinated by music, and not just focusing on, okay, I heard this tune and I like it and I will listen to it again. No, going deeper into it, looking past the aspects of music that are dated because they pertain to a different time, like so many of the older recordings, especially in our film music, they would not hold up to the standards of recording that we have today. So when you look past them and still love those songs, what accounts for that? It's fascination. It's fascination. And especially in my case, I could easily account for fascination being the number one driver, because I don't necessarily like all the older film music. I'm not very much into 1940s in the film music. The film music that was made by even Naushad himself in the 1940s, his style was very different, and there are others like Pankaj Malik, Anil Biswas. I'm not very much into that period. I start getting interested actually from roughly from Baijubara onwards, and I do prefer the 1960s somewhat to 1950s in Hindi, which is a little controversial for Hindi music connoisseurs, but hey, that's my taste. So it, I can definitely say, because if it was about nostalgia even for an earlier time that is before the time that you lived in, then I should ideally also like the 1940s. But no, so there is a point where it starts to interest me intensely, and there's a point again that you, for in my case, you start to get to that point from around the mid 1980s, where the sound of Hindi music started changing in a direction that I didn't necessarily like. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like any 1980s Hindi songs or 1990s songs or 2000s or today. No, but at that time it went started to go in a direction. And what is that direction? If I would put a term to it, I would say that was the time that even the directors and producers were no longer fascinated by music. That is to say that the earlier directors were themselves deeply interested in the quality of music in their films. For K. Asif, definitely Naushad's music for Mughal Azam was a very important part of his film. And likewise, Shakti Samanta was very much interested in music. That's why the music in most of his films was just amazing. Again, Vijay Anand, he would have definitely have to been interested in music to have wanted a soundtrack of that quality out of SD Burman. So that started to change in the 1980s, and not necessarily in a positive way, because now the obsession became with getting hits at all costs, even if the songs are blatantly copied. No, Hindi composers used to copy even before the 1980s, but there used to be at least an attempt to change it into something else, something that actually sounded like it was in the style of that composer. If you take Chura Liya Hai Tumne, the tune is copied from a song called If It's Tuesday, but the thing is, Chura Liya doesn't sound anything like If It's Tuesday. It sounds like an R.D. Burman song. So, I mean, that doesn't excuse plagiarism, but he was making an effort to appropriate it into his style. In the 1980s, they stopped even making that effort, and this becomes clear when you listen to Tamma Tamma Loge, which was copied from an African song which actually has the words Tamma Tamma. See, they didn't even bother to change the vocal refrain, the lyric refrain. And you can get another example of this in Tamil. You take the song Aragiya Leila, which was copied from, I think it is a Moroccan artist. I'm not very, very sure about that right now. But if you listen to the original, it's copied almost note for note. Even the interlude has a similar, vocalization, or what they call humming in film music, as what you have. So the humming that you hear in the Tamil song is almost the same as what you will hear in the original. So they have not even made an effort to change it into something else. So that I am going to use a strong word here. It's crass. That kind of crass commercialization took root in Hindi in the 1980s. It started to surface in Tamil also in the 1990s, but then in Tamil, Ilayaraja was still very active, and more importantly, A.R. Rahman was at the absolute top of his game. So that put some pressure, firstly, on the others also to up their game, and secondly, when you had so much quality music coming out, then you didn't really bother so much about what Sirpi was doing, for example. But this, obsession with hit making rather than fascination, it then leads us to today's scenario, where you're asking that why cannot Anirudh be compared to Ilayaraja or Rahman, because after all he also delivers hits. Yeah, but the point here that I'm making, and I know that there will be many others who would also agree, and not necessarily because they're also Ilayaraja and Rahman fans. The point is that there was more to what Ilayaraja or Rahman were doing than hit making. They were also trying to satisfy themselves and to satisfy music lovers like us, and not just restrict themselves to giving a hit to the director. So they're really like masters of their craft. So they have the confidence that they can give you a hit and still also make something interesting with that song. Now, what is this word interesting? It does sound a lot like the word fascination. And yes, so my theory or my take here is that The composer should also be fascinated by music, and he should be fascinated, he or she, why restricted gender wise? The composer should also be fascinated by music to a degree where he or she or they, as you wish, the applicable pronoun, would want to make the music fascinating and not worry that that effort would cost them a hit. Now, yes, that is difficult in film music, but let's also remember that even today there are very few films that have just one song in the soundtrack. Most of them, when they do have songs, they still have at least two or three. So, how about why can't you use one song to do something interesting, and the other songs can still be hits? And in fact, this is exactly what Ilayaraja used to do very often. So, I mean, of course, he was such a master, such a maestro that he could make even the mass market songs interesting when you looked hard enough. But forget about that. Let's take us so and let's take a film like Payanangal Mudivadillai. So you have A Atta is like the absolute bog standard Raja mass song. It's like it's definitely made for mass market. It's made to get him the hit that he needs to give the director. Now, even Eata has interesting things going on, but then you compare that to Ilayanila, of course, or Saleorum, then those songs are even more interesting. So, again, Ilayanila is so interesting that it's such a great song that it is also a hit and also is fascinating. But in that song, I would argue that Ilayaraja emphasized the fascination part of it more. And then you go to a film like Moodapani, and there you could say that the emphasis on hit making is even less. Now, it's another matter that Yenine Punilave is considered a classic. It's still replayed to this day over and over. But though both Yenine Punilave and Paruva Kalangal, both of them are very, very fascinating songs. And this is not just my inference. Ilayaraja said many times, when people have asked him, why did you do this or why did you do that in a particular song, then he would say, well, I was kind of bored and I wanted to play around. So that's exactly it. He wants to make music making fun for himself, and the way for him to do that is by trying to do something interesting, something fascinating in effect with the music. And that is the common thread really that connects great musicians, great composers over the years, more so I would say than hit making. There are numerous hit makers. If you take a look over at what goes on in western pop music, then many of the pop hits are actually not written by the, I would say, the banner artist, like say a Britney Spears. The song may not be written by her, but by a team of songwriters that the record labels employ for that purpose. So it's not about hit making. There are actually many more hit makers in the world than you would realize. So hit making by itself is not such an unique endeavor, though by no means am I saying that it's easy or it's not commendable at all. No, it is a commendable skill. Certainly, I would say that to the extent that I can make music at all, I wouldn't be able to boast that I could give you a hit. No, certainly I would respect Anirudh's skill in being able to deliver hits, but does that make it the same level of skill that an Ilayaraja or Rahman brought to the table? No, because what actually ties together great artists over the years is their ability to make something fascinating, and the ones that are you know popular and remembered over the years, so for years and years, even after they made this composition originally, like in Ilayaraja's case himself, like songs like Panivirum Malarvanam, which was written in 1982, and here we are in 2024 and people still love that song. So in the case of artists like Ilayaraja, they are able to consistently find that zone where what they are doing that is fascinating is also palatable to the audience, and the aspect that is fascinating is also easily evident. So it's not something that's too arcane or too avant-garde. And I'm not saying by any means that it is wrong for artists to attempt avant-garde things. I'm actually a fan of a lot of experimental acts in music, but the if you take the kind of canonized artists like Mozart or Beethoven, Bach, Vivaldi in Western classical music. Again, in jazz, I mentioned the names like Louis Armstrong, John Coltrane. So, what binds them all together is that their greatness is in essence, or rather, I would say, what makes their music fascinating continues to be evident to generation after generation after generation. So a common argument is that the only reason that you people still listen to Ilayaraja is because you grew up on his music and it will die out once you guys get old. But for example, I was not born in like the 1970s. I was born in 1985, and the first time I remember listening to an Ilayaraja song was in the 1990 Talapati, not one of his older 1980s soundtracks. So that's me, for example. And then I know, in fact, through my writing on my blog or my discussions on Bharatwaj Rangan's blog, I have met people in the 20s who are listening to Ilayaraja's music. So I don't necessarily buy that argument. No, let's see. I'm not saying that that argument is necessarily wrong, but let's see whether his music stands the test of time even further. Let's see for how many more years people continue to remember Ilayaraja's music. Let's see for how many more years people continue to remember A.R. Rahman's music. Why do we have to conclude today that, oh, this is already old hat? Because there seems to be no evidence of it when you look at the live concerts, for example. The concerts of Raja and Rahman get sold out. Their tickets cost quite a lot, and they perform in stadiums. It can't be all only older people filling up the stadiums. There must be younger people also, people in the 20s attending these shows. So now naturally these now this is the important part. These 20 somethings also, when they get married and have kids, they are going to, or even if they don't get married, if they keep chatting on wherever, on blogs or WhatsApp or you name it, on internet or the social media, they are going to keep talking about Ilayaraja. So they will pass on this fascination with Ilayaraja's music to a new generation. So it may keep going on and on. So let's see how many of the other composers from Ilayaraja and Rahman's time, that is other than them of course, are able to establish that kind of longevity. Until then, why do we have to conclude that this is only related to demographics? I, for one, am not convinced that it's that simple. So I think that's quite a lot about the topic of fascination in music. If you have some comments on this or some things you'd like to ask me regarding this formulation, please do comment. And of course, please do like the video if you enjoyed it. And for more videos like this, please subscribe and press the bell icon to get notified of more videos. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.